Hi friends, and welcome back to another Before You Read lecture. This Before You Read lecture will be perhaps a little bit longer than some of our previous lectures in so far as I want to provide a sort of basic introduction to the concept, to the idea of Israel's wisdom literature, sort of broadly considered, before diving into a brief orientation to the book of Proverbs and offering some reading guidance for select chapters in Proverbs. So I want to begin with one of my favorite teaching tricks is to create a 4 on something. So this would be a 4 on the wisdom literature, 4 things for you to remember, to keep in mind about the literature, about wisdom literature more broadly conceived. So first is the concept of wisdom itself. So when we look at the Hebrew Bible, there are 2 important words related to wisdom. The first is called chokmah, and chokmah concerns a skill in technical manners. It can also refer to shrewdness or experience. It can be a reference to the wisdom of Israel or the wisdom of other nations, as well as God's wisdom. And in Proverbs, we'll see that chokmah is the sort of personification of wisdom. A second word that's important for us to think about is actually a Greek word, Sophia. And Sophia is, again, the capacity to understand and function in an appropriate way. It might be considered natural wisdom or wisdom that belongs to the world, or it can refer to transcendent wisdom or even personified wisdom in some Greek writing. And so basically, biblical wisdom in its most basic understanding is that which sort of even informs or inspires, we might say, the most mundane tasks. Things like weaving or knitting are considered an expression of wisdom. You can look at Exodus 31 verses 1 through 5 to see that the creators of parts of God's holy space in the book of Exodus are said to have wisdom, chokmah. Wisdom, according to the Old Testament scholar John Collins, is knowing when to use an individual saying aptly in context. So wisdom is about context, it's about experience, it's observable, we might say, and it can also then be elevated to something that is personified or embodied and even can be connected with God. The second part of our 4 on the wisdom literature concerns Solomon and the sages. So King Solomon, the son of David, the king of Israel, is often connected with wisdom in Israel, with Israel's wisdom tradition. And in point in fact, it's probably a little bit of idealistic remembering, in the same way that the Psalms are often attributed or connected to David, but those connections might be a little loose in some cases. The same could be said about Solomon and the book of Proverbs. But we see in 1 Kings chapter 4, verses 29 through 31, just one instance of Solomon's great wisdom. And so he did have a reputation of having wisdom, but it seems more likely that the memory of Solomon was connected to these groups of scholars or these groups of wise counselors. So if we look at the books of 1st and 2nd Kings or 1st and 2nd Samuel, we see that there are these groups of counselors that often accompany the kings. They often are advisors to the king, and they offer a source of wisdom. And Old Testament scholars think that these groups, these counselors, eventually became identifiable as a distinct group, or even a school within Israel that became known as the wise or the sages. And so if we think about this trajectory, it probably started with some wise people who lived in a village, sort of a very local understanding of wisdom and wisdom's school. Eventually, they became members of the royal court, so a little bit more prominence and a little bit more formality. And that finally then gave birth to professional scribes or professional sages who ran schools and identified themselves as an intellectual class. There's evidence for this in Ecclesiastes 12, which is in our Old Testament Hebrew Bible, but it seems to be much more developed by that period in between the writing of the Old Testament and the New Testament, in something like the wisdom of Ben Sira, that seems to indicate much more likely that there was a school, that there was a sort of whole class of Israelites who were identified as sages or the wise. The third thing that I want to talk about in this 4 on is the wisdom literature itself. And this, I should say, is contested territory among specialists. There's was a book published a few years back challenging the whole notion of wisdom literature as a distinct genre within the Hebrew Bible or even in the ancient world. But traditionally, what scholars have noted is that there was this widespread practice of using proverbs or short sayings, and that these were then collected. And we can sort of study these in a cross-cultural and trans-historical way and see commonalities and some common threads. And so it seems as though this wisdom genre, this wisdom tradition, developed in Egypt in the 2000s BCE, and that these short sayings, these sayings of wisdom, were copied by scribes and passed down over generations. And as we'll see in the book of Proverbs, these topics that were often considered in these Egyptian wisdom texts include things like the relationships between superiors and inferiors, between friends and foes, between, we might say, parents and children. They contained warnings about women. They contained advice about moral virtues, and this underlying idea that if you're morally virtuous, you'll be successful. And so there is some echoing or some similarities in Proverbs 22, verses 17 through 23, verse 11, that follows closely an Egyptian wisdom text. You can explore that on your own. And so when we think about the wisdom literature of Israel, in Jewish tradition, this is grouped together, it's lumped together in the section known as the writings, near the back of the Jewish Bible. And we would identify things like Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Job, and maybe part of the Psalms as part of the biblical wisdom tradition or the Israelite wisdom tradition. But in the time period, again, between the last Old Testament writing and the first New Testament writing, we have this wonderfully productive period in Jewish history, and we get Greek writings like Ben Sira and the Wisdom of Solomon that are also wisdom books. And these books, more so than those that are found in the biblical canon, integrate Greek philosophical concepts and broader understandings of wisdom into their work. The final thing that I want to talk about probably is the most important for the purposes of our time together, and that is the wisdom worldview. And again, there's debates and there's probably nuances and some outliers, but it's really important for us to understand what was the wisdom worldview. And so, first of all, wisdom asks big questions about life, and it addresses all of life. So it concerns everything from the most mundane, things like how do we eat, who do we eat with, what do we do with farming, to the most elaborate, the most important, like the nature of God or the nature of the universe. And so we see that in the wisdom literature, there is a sort of a distinct worldview. Unlike the prophets, or unlike the writings, or unlike the Torah in the first 5 books of the Jewish Bible, there's little interest in special or divine revelation. This is in contrast to the prophets. They are not really interested in the life of worship or cultic sacrifice. There are different notions even of how creation comes about in Proverbs 8, for example, compared to Genesis 1 through 2. Wisdom literature, in its orientation, is almost entirely grounded, focused on human experience. So it's not on divine revelation or worshiping divine, but it's on human experience. It is human experience that provides the sort of school or the laboratory for learning wisdom. And so there's a couple of important wisdom ideas, and this is what I would call normal wisdom, or wisdom for an ordered world, which I'll say more about in just a few moments. But the idea here is that God has built wisdom into creation. And therefore, you don't need special books. You don't need special revelation. What you need is to pay attention to creation, because God has already provided wisdom. God has built wisdom into the created order. And so the source of wisdom becomes careful observation, understanding how cause and effect work. And ultimately, it's about accumulating a body of knowledge that is given through experience. And so this is why wisdom literature tends to be so, sort of passing down of information. If you learn an experience and you can share that with me, so hopefully I don't have to experience it myself. That's one way in which wisdom is transmitted, one way in which wisdom is passed down. And so that's the 4 on wisdom. Again, the concept of wisdom, Solomon and the scribes, or the school of wisdom, the wisdom worldview, and the fourth one, wisdom literature in the Hebrew Bible. Let me turn now to a brief orientation to the wisdom literature known as Proverbs, or what I referred to earlier as wisdom for an ordered world. And so this is, Proverbs is a collection of wise sayings. And if you read all of Proverbs carefully and you pay attention to what are known as the superscriptions, or the headings, you'll realize actually it's a pretty diverse collection of writings. So the verses 1:1 through 9:18 are identified as the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. And then from 10:1 to 22:16, we have more Proverbs of Solomon. So far, so good. But then in 22:17, we are told we're receiving the words of the wise, unidentified wise. Similarly, in 24:23, that section is about the words or the sayings of the wise. Then in chapters 25 through 29, we have other Proverbs of Solomon that the men of Hezekiah collected. Then in chapter 30, we receive the words of Agur, son of Jacob, who we don't otherwise know much about in the Hebrew Bible. And then in 31, 1 through 9, we receive the words of King Lemuel, another sort of, figure, mysterious figure. And so it's interesting, it's important to note that even though Proverbs has this great connection to Solomon, that the writing itself identifies other sources, other parts of the collection. And so when we think about Proverbs as a whole, we see much of what I've said above or earlier about wisdom, that wisdom is really an invitation to observe and experience. It's an invitation to verify the experiences and even dispute some of those. A proverb, by definition, is something that gives a very narrow glimpse at reality. They are true if you say them at the right moment, but not if you apply them in the wrong setting. That's what Jerry Sumney says in his introduction to the Bible. So they're true when used rightly, but not so true when used in the wrong context or the wrong setting. Very often the proverbs that we'll see are simple propositional statements. This is good, this is bad, this is helpful, this is harmful, with very little gray, little debate. So in Proverbs 12:25, anxiety weighs down the human heart, but a good word cheers it up. very almost simplistic in its statements. And we see that observation leads to categorization. Throughout the Proverbs, we'll see that much of the wisdom that is passed on is experience-based. It is, in a way, taking, sort of experience and saying, well, it's obvious that this is the case. We see in Proverbs 11:5, the righteousness of the innocent makes their path straight, but the wicked fall in their wickedness. Again, it's pretty simplistic. It's pretty black and white in its orientation. Very often we'll see in Proverbs the use of analogies. We'll see in Proverbs that the world is ordered, that it is predictable, that it is observable. And so we see simple cause and effect in Proverbs 23:29. Drunkenness leads to wounds and red eyes. Or in Proverbs 24, verses 30 through 34, laziness and idleness lead to poverty, right? Again, it's a simple understanding. It's an ordered world. And while the Bible doesn't contain the phrase, God helps those who help themselves, this sort of thinking is really part of Proverbs. It is, this is how ethics work. If you live rightly, things are going to go good for you. And if you live foolishly, things are going to go poor for you, right? That's the simplistic understanding that we see in Proverbs. There is this tension, I would say, between pragmatism on the one hand and idealism on the other. So in some cases, Proverbs can be very pragmatic about how to order your life in a way that is going to make it the easiest or the most successful possible. But then there are other places where it's more idealistic, where we might care for the poor even though there is no immediate benefit for doing so. And we see that, for example, in Proverbs 14, 19, and 22. So there are these tensions between pragmatism and idealism. And again, maybe part of understanding that tension is that wisdom is always situational. Something may be right in one context, but it might be wrong in another context. The person or the character of God in the Proverbs is not mentioned significantly. It's not the center often, but God is identified as the guarantor or the establisher of the cosmic order. In some ways, God limits human capacity, and humans, for all of their pursuit of wisdom, remain dependent as creatures on God's care and God's creation of the world. Let me now give you just a few pointers for your reading of Proverbs. The first is, as you read, consider where do you see the role of experience in forming or creating wisdom? How does lived experience lead to wisdom? A second question is, where do you see the notion of an ordered world? Of a world in which God has established creation and maybe certain laws or practices, and that those basically go on uncontested, so that good people get good things and bad people get bad things. Where do you see the notion of an ordered world? Third, where do you see a tension between pragmatism and idealism? And finally, do you see any contradictions or tensions within the book of Proverbs? Well, friends, I've said a lot about wisdom and about the wisdom literature in Israel, and a little bit about the book of Proverbs. I'm looking forward to our conversation about Proverbs, about our selection from Proverbs, and I hope that you will enjoy your engagement with the book of Proverbs. Happy reading.